So, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to Geraldine Beskin.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I was saying that, to my shame, I've never been here before. I've had flyers for it. I've heard great references to it. You know, people come back to London and tell me how great this is. But I think I'll come back as a real-life human next time and just sit and enjoy it instead of worrying about my talk. The last speaker made me think about the Mormons. When lots of people now are sending off their DNA to find out if they've got a Spanish grandmother or something they didn't know about, and we pay for that privilege, which means that because the Mormons own the process of finding that out, we are financing the Mormons, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but what are they doing with all the DNA samples that they now have harvested? And how are they going to mix and rematch them? What vision do they have for a perfect set of humanoids or a perfect yellow race, purple race, orange race in years to come? So I just thought, about that one really. But Thomas Dewar was a chemist who was a Scot, and he invented the thermos flask. But amongst other things, he said, minds are like parachutes. They work better when they're open. And I feel that about ghosts and extraterrestrials and anything that is normally thought of as spooky. It's working in another dimension to us. But those experiences, those phenomenon, have happened and do happen all around the world and have done through all cultures for millennia. So there must be something in it, really. There was another Scot, Robert Kirk, who wrote Secret Commonwealths of Elves, Fauns and Fairies and a short treatise on charms and spells way back in the 1690s. And he said, how much is written of pygmies, fairies, nymphs, apparitions, though no 10th part true, yet could not spring from nothing. And that, in a way, is how Helen Duncan earned her living. She worked in a mysterious way to a very, very, very highly skilled degree, whilst having a most awful personal life in lots of ways. In the end, she was persecuted. It was the last of the British witch trials in real terms, although she was not a witch. That's what they did her for being, because it's still easy, isn't it? If there's somebody who knows something around the office, and really, how do they know that? Instead of saying, blimey, you must be psychic, or you've done good work, they say, oh, you're a witch. It's easy to blacken people like that. So she has high skills, she had very high skill sets. Without her trial, then witchcraft would have stayed illegal in Britain as it was until 1951. And I'm very proud of the fact that after the war, Gerald Gardner, who's the great-grandfather of the modern witchcraft revival, his coven met in my shop from about 1947 onwards, and all those years when it was illegal. And I'm proud of our aspect of being renegades. I think all of us here rather like being renegades. And we're hard to catch because we do things slightly differently. And different laws apply to us as well as the normal ones. But I'm very proud of the guy who started our shop in 1922 and allowed that to go on. So she was born in Callander, up in Scotland. Yes, just right. In 25th of November 1897, to Archibald MacFarland, who was slater and roofer in Callander, as I say, at the foot of the Trossachs in Scotland. The Victoria part of her name is possibly from when some very highfalutin visitors turned up at her grandmother's house in a terrible, terrible storm and asked to borrow an umbrella. They were invited in for tea. What they didn't know until the umbrella was returned a couple of weeks later with a very pretty note from Balmoral saying thank you very much indeed. Her grandmother was forever mortified that she hadn't used the best china. So she was one of those straight up and down Scots, a very sturdy little Scottish woman she was, and she had hair coal black as a raven's. She was a tomboy. At school, she was absolutely, genuinely hopeless. or she would hold the slate to her chest and the answers would appear and they would all be right. And she had no control over that. She really didn't get it. She was known as Hellish Nell because she had a fearful temper, basically, and she kept that all her life. And in ways, no bad thing, really. She was... The Trossachs are where the Highlands meet the Lowlands, and they were meant to be brought up evangelical Presbyterian, but the hills behind it still harboured the ghosts and the ghoulies, and the fairy rings and the ghostly warriors, the hags and the necromancers were very, very real to the people who lived there. There was the strong belief in Scottish second sight, gift of prophecy, and even St James Fraser's 13 volumes of the Golden Bough. He still it was a Christian interpretation of native folklore, if you like, but he still stayed faithful and acknowledged the depth of belief and the variety of experiences that they had up there. So, James I of Scotland, who became James VI of England, when his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, died. She died, his dad was in prison, terrible upbringing, I think we can all agree. He was convinced that witches had caused the storms that had shipwrecked his ship as a protest at his attempts to bond the Protestant states of England and Scotland. He was further disconcerted by a witch repeating the pillow talk that he'd said to his wife on their wedding night. I think anybody would be a bit annoyed at that. He called them extreme liars and that their master was the devil. And he sat in on their trials. He physically came to court when they were being persecuted and approved their executions. And he wrote a nasty little essay called Demonology in 1597. When he succeeded to the British throne, English throne in 1603, he had it amended, updated, slightly revised, and reprinted. The Witchcraft Act of 1604 put in a clause prescribing death for invocation and conjurations of diabolic spirits alone, not for witchcraft. In 1763, both English and Scottish statutes were repealed and replaced by a single act of 1735 that made the pretence of conjuring an offence, a measure of which, according to one Scottish antiquarian, turned the witch into a cheat and an impostor and substituted the pillory for the stake. It's only if you pretend this stuff you can do this stuff. It drives a coach and horses through the idea that actually this stuff is real. It rather allows for the fact that this stuff is real. And then, as I say, that was replaced in 1951 by the repeal of the Witchcraft Act. That was repealed by the Fraudulent Mediums Act, which was then replaced by the Fraudulent Mediums Act. And then about 15 years ago, we all came under the Trades Descriptions Act. So if you read tarot or anything at all like that, you have to say it's just a game. And some credit card companies won't take payments for tarot readings, which is quite a biggie, really, unless you say it's just a game. So we, as I say, Trade Descriptions Act. The Church of England vicars don't have to come under the Trade Descriptions Act. So Callender was famous with Wordsworth's poetry and Walter Scott's verse romance, The Lady of the Lake, Rob Roy, all of that whole thing. The nature up there is sublime, really, in lots and lots of ways. Keats loved it, but then they found that it became too popular and they were having 3 steamers a day coming to this tiny little space and absolutely ruining everything. The Prime Minister Gladstone, for instance, didn't think that the development of the railways was a good idea because it meant the working classes could move around, get in the way of his fishing and things. So the population there was bilingual, Gaelic and English, and one of the hotels there, the Dreadnought, they had a plaster cast of the head of one of their enemy clans on the gable end of it to warn the others what they would do to him because they'd beheaded that particular fella. So it stayed fairly hairy up there, really. She was, in some ways, Helen was a bit like Susan Boyle, a bit unreconstructed, a God-given talent, but with no social skills worth a damn. You know, but more expectedly then. In her teens, her prophecies were laughed at when she said that a war would last for 4 years and there would be machines moving along on their stomachs without the help of horses. She saw the tank, which was in large part developed by JFC Fuller, who was a great friend of Aleister Crowley's, but that's a whole other story. But I can't mention any of in my talks. I have to mention Crowley at least once. It seems to be a law of the universe. I'm sorry, it just has to be done. She also spent her agitated nights not sleeping, but dealing with a recently dead soldier from the war, and with another one who was alive but very sick. He contracted rheumatic fever after a long bout of fighting at the front with the Black Watch, who were ferocious fighters. He came home, and of course he turned out to be the brother of their best friends, and audience, she married him. Yes. They were devoted to each other. And she and her Henry, they loved each other dearly. And they produced 8 children in as many years. This is what they looked like. And which was quite standard for the times. No contraception, no money, no hot water, a poor diet, poor education, and a low life expectancy are still the ingredients if you live a life of poverty. Henry was frequently ill and for months. And at 17, Helen had a tubercular lung and antibiotics hadn't been invented. Isabella and Helen, too, were the first 2 children. Child 3, Henrietta, was born with arms and legs dislocated and died at 13 months. Henry had a nervous breakdown and a heart attack at that. He couldn't bear that this baby had died. So he was out of the picture for a long time. He'd been running a little business that had to be sold off to pay debts. So Helen Duncan went to live in the local sort of linen place, really, where she got a frozen kidney, and the only treatment for that was to be taken to hospital and wrapped in hot blankets. There was no other way of hoping to thaw it out. Of course, she was pregnant again at the time. While that was all happening, the grandmother could only take 1 child, so the other child was shipped off to friends who were living in a caravan in a field somewhere. She was 2 weeks or 2 months old, I can't remember which, and a ferret ate her face. The baby survived, but was never the same again. The next child, number 5, Henry Jr., he weighed in at 10.5 pounds, and the next one, Peter, weighed in at 3.5 pounds. So Gina, one of the kids, was the only psychic one amongst them. She grew up with a lymphedema on her arms and legs, as Helen had prenatal measles and preeclampsia. Alex, child 8, died at 13 months of pneumonia, and then she became pregnant again and was forced to have an abortion because she wouldn't have survived the pregnancy. I've gone into all of this because this is a life of poverty even now for lots of people. All these emotional traumas, any one of them would break any of our hearts. You know, we would take to strong drink, strong drugs, never leave the house again, you know, kick the cat, whatever we would do. But she had to just be heedless. And she was young. I'll put my pen away. But she didn't set herself up cynically as a medium to pay the rent. It was because she was barely literate. Henry liked magazines and things like that, and he used to read to her and another friend. And then they became interested in spiritualism. And then as they blew the candle out one night after this, a man's name, Albert, appeared in the smoke. And a tie-pin appeared as well as proof for the friend that something strange was about to happen. And it duly did. Helen had no memory of any of this because she was in trance. And that was the beginnings of the most famous medium of the 20th century. Somebody came to her in absolute despair financially, and she told him what she saw. He noticed a horse with a name that linked to her prophecy, Double Chance, and backed it with his last few pence. It won him a fortune, and he bought Henry the expensive overcoat that he's wearing there, and a watch for Helen with the winning horse's name inscribed on it. Double Chance was the beginning of the end for the Duncans, because suddenly she began to believe that what she was saying would come true, and when one of her children, Gina, say the psychic one, met her Uncle Bob for the first time, she was 3 or 4, and she talked to him in Hindustani in the style of somebody, an Indian boy that he'd known when he was in the army in India. She knew that it could happen somehow in this terrible, grim surroundings that they lived in. And so Albert Stewart was her guide, as we call it, and he was 6'1". He stayed with her all her life, really, Albert. Somebody didn't believe, well, lots of people didn't believe he was real, but somebody took it a stage further because the middle classes do tend to think that they have an entitlement to these things, and so they groped around under his robes and declared him to be all man when they'd finished. But it was still spiritual, what he was feeling, so very strange. In their little house, they created a cabinet with a curtain, a chair, and a red light in the corner of their living room. And then ectoplasm began to flow from her by the yard. There should be a bag going the rounds with bits of gauze in it, and it's as near as I can get to ectoplasm because it's a very rare substance. And what would happen with Helen Duncan is yards and yards and yards of this stuff would come out from between her nose and her eyes, from her ears, from her mouth, and not only appear, because what you've got to do with the bits, if you choose to, is stuff it up your nose. See how much of it you can stuff up your nose. I've tried, I can get about 4 inches up there. And then you've got to project it. You've got to sit on your hands and project it out further, right? When you're tied in a bag, when you're in a bag that's tied at the neck, and then your hands and feet are tied to the legs and arms of a chair, because that was her working day. And before that, she would have been stripped naked, examined internally and externally, and just to see that she had nothing hidden about her person, and then she would produce this stuff. And from this, she then got people appearing who were recognised. No, they didn't just sound like their dead relatives, because lots of people can do accents, lots of people can imitate people, but this would become visible, identifiable as Great Aunt Maud or whoever. So, as I say, do try it. I recommend it. So, some people can swallow nails and razor blades and other non-food items, and so she was meant to do that. She had very, very, very low self-esteem. She was a bit of a case, really. She did eat things at random. Cigarette ends, nails, bits of fluff, odd bits and pieces of things. And she was self-destructive. She smoked too much, she drank too much. Her diet was appalling. It was stodge. It was chips, porridge, bread, cakes, loves cakes, with sweets, all these nice instant things that how badly people on the go tend to eat anyway nowadays. Washed down with whiskey, constantly tired, constantly feeling she was neglecting the kids, the only breadwinner because Henry was never well enough to work. People said that he sponged off her. He didn't have much choice. His body was absolutely shot, basically. And all her working life, she was doing it in front of the credulous, the hostile, the inquisitive eyes and minds of people. That's them again. When they've made a few bob, she's doing extremely well by this time because she was always industrious, but in the early years she didn't really charge for things, and then she had cottoned on to the fact that she could have a fee. You know, if you go to the dentist or the doctor, you pay a fee. So that's what she did. Somebody said that C.E.M. Joad, the popular philosopher who was never off the radio at the time, suggested that she had a second stomach like a cow. So she was duly x-rayed, because Professor Joad had suggested it. Oddly enough, she only had one. Somebody else said that she was so fat, you could hide anything in the rolls of fat. and that her internal workings were so stretched by all these pregnancies, you could have got an armchair up there. And then she's got to get on stage and perform. So there were 50 photographs taken showing the ectoplasm. And I say, they had to get agreement from Spirit to take them because I'm a trained medium, and when you're working, bright lights, sudden shocks are really, really dangerous. I've only been swacked amidships once by someone, and I will never forgive them for it. And I'm quite a tough old bird, and I felt rotten. It really was a very, very, very nasty experience. Add in the malice with which the woman did it, and, but never mind. So, there we have her producing ectoplasm. One of her great benefactors, in a way, was Helen Swaffer, who was the most influential journalist in Fleet Street at the time. He was also a spiritualist, and Austin Spare the psychic and magical artist, used to go to his flat at the post office at Trafalgar Square, as it is now, and draw it for spirit stuff for Swaffer, or Swaff as he was known. He was like Piers Morgan, only nice. He had as much influence as Piers Morgan did, really. He was quite a principled man and really had rather charm. And because of his spiritual interest, he knew Maurice Barbanel, who set up Psychic News in the 30s. And he said, "I'd swallow until I were drunken, but know the bunk of Helen Duncan. If I were swallowing more and more things spiritus or beery, I'd swallow anything more before the Price regurgitation theory." Because Harry Price, the paper bag salesman turned psychic investigator, Harry Price, first, last and forever, was his motto through life, I strongly suspect. He decided that she was a regurgitator, that she just swallowed it all, and she just gave it all back when people had paid to see her perform. Spiritualism was massively popular in the 1930s, and in 1935, the Spiritualist National Union had 250,000 members. Which, they were not bothered by the establishment, and they were part of the newness of attitudes following the First World War, where all classes had suffered so atrociously. The spiritualists saw Jesus as a great medium whose work was found in a compendium of paranormal phenomenon called the Bible. That offended the Church of England, and the Catholics saw spirits as devilish deceptions. So in 1917 had banned communicants from attending seances in any guise. So, the College of Psychic Studies, typically a clairvoyant was a middle-aged spinster wearing owlish glasses. The materializers had a sexual vitality. They were sexually flush with an electric life force coursing through their bodies. The very best were of a gross material nature and of a lymphatic temperament. Helen Duncan fitted the bill very well. She was coarse, gross, a fishwife, and obese mother of 6 surviving children. A businessman reported she was in a light brown dress, a large, ungainly woman who moved slowly as though she suffered from heart trouble, a fatty heart, a doctor later said. That's a very technical term. Heart trouble or a glandular affection, and had not to hurry. She was by no means a magnetic personality, rather a repellent one that aroused one's critical faculties. I think she was as near to a noble savage as the middle and upper class Londoners who came to watch her as she was in laboratory conditions would ever meet, really. And they probably felt that she was too innately primitive to be able to do anything than be a clear channel for spirit. One psychic researcher who was well thought of in the world of snake venom, which was his speciality, said, after all, that women made good mediums as they were sensitive and relatively untroubled by reason. So Helen thrived out. They came to London, Helen thrived. Helen Henry always by her side. He was kind of her manager. He wrote a column for her where he got paid £15 a week for it. That was vast amounts of money. They really, really hit the big time, really. And they went off to live in Thornton Heath with a maid and everything. She had a sort of an autograph book with glowing testimonials. She was ready to be accredited by the Natural Spiritual Union, which meant that she had to pass tests and then they would verify her as not being a fake. So she went to 16 Queensbury Place, where the college still is, and she saw a tall, thin man go up the stairs, and she took ahead of her, and she just had a feeling about him. And she turned to Henry and she said, "He's going to bring me trouble." And of course, that was Harry Price. And he was on his way to his National Laboratory of Psychical Research on the top floor. He called the people who he was paying rent to at the college as them downstairs. He was a contemptuous and odious man. What makes his legacy good is that he was greedy and he vacuumed up any book on the esoteric that he could find, ghosts and everything else as well. He then tried to get his massive library housed somewhere as the Harry Price Library. Nobody wanted it. The college didn't want it because they hated him. So eventually it got into Senate House as part of London University. They turned it down 4 times, but thank goodness it's there because it is a fabulous, greedy man's library, and thank goodness for it, as I say, really. So Helen did very well in accuracy in a number of standard examinations. Her guide, Albert, was a little exasperated. One of the assessors said she'd managed to get out of the sack she was tied in by elongation. She couldn't, I couldn't do it, she couldn't do it. You know, don't ask too much of us. And Albert said that he was a fool, he was a perfect ass with his theories. And so she would just do her stuff, do the tests, and then she'd sit down and have a cigarette and a cup of tea and a biscuit while they just talked about her. She was not interested in that bit at all. The twice-weekly assessments put a strain on them all, and Albert in spirit and Henry in real life bickered together, which would have been quite interesting, really, because she was meant to be the psychic one who could see him. Harry Price came sniffing around and approached Henry with an offer of £9 a week for Helen to work with him. And as that was 3 times a man's wage, they must have been tempted, but were doing it well enough with the college paying their £85 rent for the year, and Helen was being paid for her sittings as well. Now, Harry had struck it big with the Borley Rectory hauntings, and he'd been scraping around ever since, looking for something else to continue the revenue from his books and keeping his name in the public eye, and Helen was the next obvious choice, really. He was looking for an exploitable situation, really. And Helen was not too good to work with, especially when she again got out of the control sack and appeared quite naked, except for a bridal veil of ectoplasm. They stepped up the security for the tests and said that she had to wear buckram mittens. The seance suit was stitched up using a secret pattern. The suit was padlocked shut, and still the phenomena were phenomenal. Society folk who were usually at smart events, as I say, just came and watched before they went off to tea at the Ritz or wherever they went. She was really, quite a chic thing. She was reported in the Tatler. Let's go and see her. She's fantastic. And then they employed this young maid to look after the home. Oh, let me show you Harry Price's laboratory. They had a young maid working at home, and she said that she'd bought butter muslin from Mrs. Duncan, and that was the ectoplasm. And that went down extremely badly, as you may imagine. A spirit girl appeared to her mother several times, but the luminous star she always wore lived in one of Helen Duncan's drawers. The London Spiritualist Alliance liked her work, but the evidence of fraud was overwhelming on occasions, they thought. The ectoplasm was shown to be surgical gauze and only appeared after obvious movements of the mouth and throat. The London Spiritual Alliance were making good money out of Helen's sittings, as they charged a guinea, £1.10p, per seat, and expected to make £500 in the first 6 months, which was twice as much as the Duncans were going to make. So Harry Price offered Henry £100 as a retainer and £10 for a weekly séance and £100 at the end of the contract. He'd got his celebrity medium. It's the only time that Helen and Henry really disagreed with each other, but Henry won on this occasion, and she went over to work for Price. So his lab, as I've shown you, was fairly primitive, but he was also a manipulator in every aspect of his life, and he did fake photographs. And you can see these are not very real looking. She is. I mean, there's a long history of faking spirit photographs. It cannot be denied. But he was using it so that he could claim her as a great medium, and he could also denounce her if it all went wrong, if Lake Street turned against him, really. And she said that his lab was a mixture of an operating theatre and a torture chamber, and the seance room was likened to a hunting lodge decked out with the trophies of exposed mediums. When a safety pin was seen attaching to the cabinet curtain that the ectoplasm had fallen from, a face cut from a magazine appeared, complete with a hand holding it in one of Price's photographs, and he lost no time at all in denouncing the Duncans. I was impressed by the brazen effrontery that prompted the Duncans to come to my laboratory. I was impressed by the amazing incredulity of the spiritualists who sat with the Duncans for 6 solid months. He'd pursued them and then faked the photographs, as I say. A series of disasters, fakery, illness, and yet more very invasive medical examinations took place as standards. The results were poor. The spirits had run out of steam, it seemed. Eventually, Henry went to the London Spiritualist Association and said Helen's materializations were a result of regurgitation. The contract was declared void. The seances went on, however, and the association continued to produce flyers advertising Mrs. Duncan's experiment in psychical phenomena. Several association members still sat with Helen privately. So they denounced her publicly, carried on making money out of her, and other ones still went to her because they saw the validity of what she was doing and how she was doing it. Helen's arm became septic. She was admitted to St Thomas's Hospital, and she tried to commit suicide for a second time. The association agreed to pay what they owed her, less expenses, and to pick up the bill to get the family back to Scotland. She disappeared with her tail between her legs, really. Price's secretary was filmed with a piece of cheesecloth, 6 foot by 2'6" in her mouth, and he wanted Helen to pose doing the same thing as he was rushing a book into print about the whole affair. The press took it up as a silly season headline grabber, and chaos ensued. He did it to get at the people downstairs, the Alliance, as he'd always referred to them. The LAS blamed Henry, who'd been lured by the gold he had in London and was thought to be a malign influence on his wife. Poor old Helen was betrayed by her husband, exposed by Harry Price, humiliated, and lost her big chance of being seen as authentic and make some serious money. So no wonder she was suicidal. So on July and August 1931, the Duncans told Two Worlds, the spiritualist magazine with them in the paper, which is still going, their side of the story. Price said his book was a contribution to medical science, but publicity and profit ruled his world. Other people, including serious Americans, supported Helen by saying ectoplasm always looked like cheesecloth. Here, too, her supporters didn't abandon her, and they fought back and made it public that the photo with the fake ectoplasm was his secretary. Price took the high moral ground and was dismissive of all criticism. The Spiritualist Natural Union granted Helen her prize diploma, and the work flooded in for her. Price realised his report denouncing her had acted like an advertisement. He got the Duncans made to take a 10.5-hour trip by train from Edinburgh to denounce her with "I bought cheesecloth for Mrs. Duncan" and all that. He then refused to pay her. So this teenage girl, and he'd offered her £10, which was absolute riches, obviously, if you could rent a house in Thornton Heath for £85 a year. She then said, "Well, I was lying to you anyway. It's not true. I just did it for the money." So that didn't help anybody either. because she, as I say, she wouldn't he wouldn't pay her, so she retracted it all. And she said she had no reason to believe Mrs. Duncan was a fraudster there. So the president of the SPR was Lord Balfour, First Lord of the Admiralty, and his voice held sway as they stood by her. Price went to see Kachinka, the human ostrich, who earned her living as a regurgitator. She said that Helen could not do what they said she did. Price, not being one to give up easily, then said there was a pernicious Jewish alliance between Maurice Barbanel of the Psychic News and the stage illusionist Will Goldston, who was creating very clever tricks for Helen. She was not the only medium, as clairvoyance, fortune-telling and other forms of divination were very popular in high and low society, and so a steady trickle of fraudsters were, and quite rightly, appearing in court. You know, if they do a bad job, you take a plumber to the small claims court. It was the same idea, really. Helen was busier than ever. She'd got a diploma and worked hard for the SNU until a man said that she was worth more than the equivalent of 50p that he'd paid for a ticket to see her. She did the math. She got 2 guineas, the SNU got £20. So she left them and charged a couple of pounds a sitting from there on. She earned more, but had no longer had the professional protection of the organisation. Pause, and Esson Maule. Esson Maule was a woman with a Radcliffe Hall-type haircut and a schoolboy's tie, and she lived in Heriot Row in Edinburgh. And she was a great mate of Harry Price's, but like most people who are up to double dealing and chicanery, didn't admit it. But in Harry Price's greedy papers, things have come to light where she said, "Thank you so much for that." And he sends her letters back to her saying, "Thank you very much, that was really, really useful," because she set Helen up to be caught again. She booked Helen to speak at her Heriot Row house. Helen had a bad feeling as she dashed from Glasgow to Edinburgh to do this sitting. She arrived, Esson Maule was in the street and said, "Come on in." She thought she'd gone into the College of Psychic Studies, which was the building which was next door to where Esson Maule lived. And it wasn't. There's this setup then happened. So she thought it was an event with the Edinburgh College and Library, as I say. The medium changed, appeared draped in white cloth, leaving her chair unoccupied. For an hour, the spirits appeared and said their bit. The familiar spirit child Peggy and was thought to be Helen on her knees mucking about. Miss Maule grabbed her, a tug of war ensued, and Helen won. The light was switched on, and a solicitor, one Elizabeth Mackay, swore that she saw Helen stuffing Peggy, the spirit child, back into her dress. Helen lost the plot, swore in a very unladylike fashion, and when asked to strip, swung a heavy chair over her head and said, "I'll brain you, you bloody bugger," and threw her shoes at Etta Maule. She calmed down and agreed to strip as the men left the room. They did, but looked through the partly open door, how nice of them, and were treated to seeing her vast bright blue knickers elasticated to the knee. They saw Peggy, who she hadn't managed to conceal when she'd whipped off her dress, and the petticoat in one go. She refused to remove her vest. You can see why. But, you know, goodness knows what a Bridget Jones's were like if that was her vest. She refused to remove her vest, but eventually said they could have their way and she would go home in the nude. She threw the vest at Miss Maule and tried to hit her with a chair again, and kept on with her threatening attitudes and hooligan tactics, swearing and cursing. The police were called, but neither side would press charges against the other because she'd been set up. Helen hadn't bothered to pick up her fee of £4 before she started the séance, but refused to leave without it. 11 days later, more than 5 others accused her of criminal fraud, and they had a receipt to prove it. The evidence was Helen's grubby vest. The magistrate sent it to the office of the Procurator Fiscal, and on the 3rd of May, Helen appeared at the Sheriff's Summary Court of the Lothians and Peebles and was fined £10, and then was soon as busy as ever. And Cambridge University Laboratory has the ectoplasmic sheet that went missing at Helen's mauling. During the Depressions, the popular press strives on 3 things: job ads, football, and horoscopes. They're also hungry for tales of magic and mystery which provide a vehicle for self-promotion for the people involved. The celebrity culture now had Madame Helen Duncan, and Helen Henry wrote columns for her. They had publicity photographs taken. She was the person to book for a private party or for to do some platform work at your spiritualist church. She was the gal to have. So during World War II, Portsmouth was a sealed-off naval base, and everyone there was actively engaged in the war, and the city was frequently bombed because of that. The gossip in the town was huge because people would be shipwrecked or they'd come back from battle or wherever it was, and they'd arrive at Portsmouth. So there was a rag bag of people always arriving, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and so they all had news of where their activity had been and so on. And so it was a very gossipy town. It still is, really. But it was meant to be in lockdown, in real terms. And there was a chemist shop run by a chap called Ernest Horner, and his common law wife Elizabeth, who was a dumpy little Welshman who could never stop talking. They were together for 25 years. They were known as Mr. and Mrs. Horner. At court, when the court thing came out, they were found to be out of wedlock, and the shame of it put them on the run. They ran away. They got caught. They got fined, but it broke their lives, really. So 301 Copner Road housed the Master Temple Psychic Centre on its first floor front room, and the colour photograph is one that I took a few years ago, so just 3 or 4 years ago, so it hasn't been knocked down or anything. It had a print of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper over the fireplace and a raised rostrum with a crucifix on the wall. On the opposite wall by the bay window, chocolate brown curtains hid the medium's cabinet, in which a sturdy Jacobean chair with a leather seat and armrests. Helen was a regular there by the end of 1942 and stayed with it round the corner. She was booked for 2 weeks in January 1943, earning £8 per séance, which was over £100 a week, which was really big money. Her psychic daughter had a terrible feeling about it. The Horners were making money out of it, but giving a large percentage of it to animal charities and so on. They weren't paying any tax because it was a pharmacy. They didn't have to. So there are all sorts of ways where you could say it was a little bit shady, but actually it wasn't shady. It's just how things were. Helen was 47 in dreadfully bad health and had never been more used to grieving families who were devastated by the losses of loved ones because of the war. Back in November 1941, a battleship, HMS Barham, which was a battleship from World War I that survived, was sunk by a German U-boat in November 1941. 300 people survived and 868 people were incinerated, blown up or drowned. Of course, there was a news embargo on it because of the war, but Helen materialised a dead soldier who the mother recognised as being her boy, but importantly for this case, his cap band said HMS Barham. Now, during the war, they didn't have the names of the ships on them, on the cap bands. They just said HMS, and that was it, or Royal Navy or whatever they said, but they didn't have the names of the ships. So the Barham was a Portsmouth ship anyway, and a woman ran the Admiralty wanting to know what was true and whether it was true and how she could have known. And Maurice Barbanel heard about it on the grapevine. He got a friend to have a sniff around in high places and see if it was true. It was, but not in the public interest for everyone to know, and there was a news embargo on it, and it had not been announced. But this shows the accuracy of what she was getting and the difficulties she was about to get into, because if you're 100% accurate, then you're a threat to national security, is the way she was perceived. The first of the people who was going to play a large part in her life later, Henry Elam, was appointed recorder of the Poole district. He was a very sharp cookie of a lawyer, and he played a big part in the court case that came along. Hold on, I'm out of order. an executive member of the Executive Committee of the International Institute of Psychical Investigation, and a member of MI5ID Division, 1D Division, Naval Security, was Roy Firebrace. He was a Royal Artillery Brigadier and head of military intelligence for Scotland. He'd known Helen for 10 years. He'd been sitting with her regularly. He was frightened of her accuracy. He knew absolutely everybody, and he kind of had his own secrets because he was a very, very, very good astrologer. So intelligence would have been using him during the war anyway for, the various things that were going on. And he kept a beady eye on everything. But he doesn't seem to have worked behind the scenes to protect Helen on this occasion. In December 1942, the Portsmouth police were looking into Helen's activities as they'd had a few complaints. The Horners were making too much money and giving just a percentage to charity. One man, Stanley Worth, thought it was harmless enough when his mother started going to the temple, was concerned how obsessed she'd become, decided to go to it on his next leave when he went along to see for himself with a friend called Cross. Chatty Mrs. Horner spent weeks saying how marvellous Helen's mediumship was and to be sure to buy tickets while they still had some left, so they booked for the 14th of January 1944. So, War Reserve Constable Rupert Cross. He was a good friend of Stanley Worth, his mate. He was the one who accompanied him to the seances. He agreed with everything Worth said. He also ran a small bookshop in Portsmouth, and in Harry Price's papers at the time, there is a compliment slip from the bookshop. He was identified as a policeman working undercover by a Mr. John Locke, who was a storeman at the Cowley Motor Works. He told his son that he'd identified Worth and felt sure he was going to expose Mrs. Duncan. In court, he denied knowing Worth, and Worth denied knowing him. Jack Locke was a chancer. He was a man who put on bets when they were illegal. He was a petty thief. He eventually, because of the court case, ran away. He left the country. He stole some meat from a butcher, sold it, and then jumped ship. In January 1944, on the 3rd of January 1944, before the fateful seance, he discussed materialisation mediums with William Spencer, who was a foreman welder at the Cowley Works, the Motor Works, and had been to Duncan's seances and believed her to be genuine. Locke bet him 25 pence that she would be arrested within a few weeks, and that somebody called Worth would be involved, and that person would be in the Navy. Spencer was never called as a witness at the trial. He was Stanley Worth's uncle, and John Locke, the petty thief, was the son of William and Bessie Locke, who turned out to be prosecution witnesses. So the tangled web begins. So Worth goes along, and the Catholic family, Worths, they go along, and the Catholic Church had denounced everybody as whores and something else if they ever went to seances and things, if they had any belief in the non-Catholic version of a spiritual world, because of the popularity of it in the First World War. So he went along, and he was less impressed after all the hype, and he went to see Police Inspector Ford the next morning. Ford said, well, we've been keeping an eye on her, and would you mind going in as a spy? Would you just do that for us? And he said, I'd bloody love to. So they issued him with a torch, and he turned up with 2 whistles and 3 detectives, and they turned up to the evening seance. After a few manifestations, Worth and Cross stood up, ripped open the curtains, and saw Helen pushing away material. He grabbed for it. Mr. Horner kicked Cross. The torches were grabbed, and the material disappeared into the audience. Helen later said, well, of course it had. It had to go somewhere. She'd been badly and irresponsibly startled out of a trance and needed a doctor. She was told to get dressed when a policewoman watched, and then arrested her on suspicion of contravening the Vagrancy Act by pretending to hold communication with the spirits of deceased persons. Fairly standard stuff. That's what you got done for. If you were a peddler without a licence, if you were telling fortunes or anything like that, they did you under the Vagrancy Act. Again, there's not a lot of logic to law necessarily, but it's an easy way of making money, I suppose. You can be destitute and con someone or tell them the truth psychically and get some money that way. Chief Constable West ensured that, unusually, that Helen was remanded in custody and driven to Holloway Jail instead of being bailed locally. They refused bail. They just would not entertain the idea. The press went crazy and even the BBC announced it. The charges were changed to conspiracy to defraud. The Horners went on the run, and because they'd made a lot of money for and with the Duncans, if a fraud had been committed between the couples, then it complicated matters. So off to the Old Bailey we go. Extraordinary. She should have got a 50p fine and told never to do it again and just left at that. That was just what always happened to people. But it didn't. It escalated really, really, really fast. West waited 2 more weeks for the Director of Public Prosecutions to consider the case. The Spiritualist National Union wanted to defend her, so the police wanted representation by counsel. So the Spiritualists appointed C. Loseby to represent her, as they couldn't find anybody more respectable. This guy was a Conservative MP, a military cross holder, wounded in World War I, a fighter for women's suffrage and the NHS, and a spiritualist. He dug out his copy of Psychic Science and Barbaric Legislation 1917 and went to work. So a naval special branch officer had written to Harry Price in December 1941, just a couple of weeks. You've got that lump of Christmas and the New Year in between all this. But in December, he wrote to Harry Price saying we could do with some help because this Helen Duncan woman is causing a bit of embarrassment and we don't quite know what to do with her. By January, she's off to the Old Bailey, and the bet has been placed 2 weeks before any of this happened. So it was a leaky sieve, all of this. It was mentioned in the subsequent trial that his contacting Harry Price was a breach of national security regulations, and that is the strongest hint of what the trial was really all about. That she was too accurate, and they didn't like it, and they decided to close it down by any means at all. Now, what they could have done was say, look, love, you're absolutely marvellous. We love it. So instead, when you get good stuff like sinking of ships through and all that, tell us, but don't tell anybody else. And we'll give you a £5 a week to keep the family fed, and we'll just say no more about it. Instead, the establishment used several sledgehammers to crack a very small nut, and it just went wild, basically. The nation was on her side. Barbanel said that they were using Gestapo tactics, and that was what they were fighting a war against. What did they think they were doing? The spiritualist world was up in uproar, had set up fighting funds to pay her lawyers' fees and all the rest of it. They refused bail again when she got to London and was held on remand. So anyway, Chief Inspector West, who is that fella there, Price sent him, he needed help, he asked Price for it. Price sent him a copy of his regurgitation in the Duncan mediumship, and he passed it on to the Director of Public Prosecutions, marked as saying that the maid, Maud Ginley, who had initially denounced her and then retracted it, should be called in rebuttal if they found that there were too many people saying that Helen Duncan was a very good medium. Price sent it over with lots of photographs to when the Director of Public Prosecutions again asked for them later. In court, he denounced Helen Duncan for defrauding and deluding people in Portsmouth, the first naval port of the world, where she would find many bereaved families, and there she practiced her trickery. He continued, This is West. She transgressed the security laws, again in a naval connection, when she told the loss of one of Her Majesty's ships long before the fact was made public. He sent back the regurgitation pamphlet to Price and the photos to him, saying, "Very, very real thanks and warm appreciation for all the kindly help and assistance you so readily rendered to me in connection with this presentation." Right. BBC, later, the BBC in 1975 interviewed him about it. And he said that he admitted that the Admiralty wanted Mrs. Duncan out of the picture without too much concern how she obtained the info about sinking warships. They didn't want that made more public than it need be anyway. By the start of 1944, there was this sense that something really had to be done. So they sent this report to the Director of Public Prosecutions, and the prosecution under the Vagrancy Act was discussed, but none of this seemed to cover what we were getting in these circumstances. Therefore, the DPP said, look here, we'll use that old Witchcraft Act. Old it is, but it will cover what we want. And that is the one we took. And the Admiralty soon gave its approval. So they were all in cahoots. West was was very quiet about an article that he wrote in the Police Review that made a point that the conviction of a medium whose fraud was unproved seemed to undermine the Home Secretary's assurance of November 1943 that only imposture would be pursued by the police. This embarrassed the Home Office, whose position was no comment until the appeal was pending. He and his family also befriended Lieutenant Stanley Worth when they attended an event at his naval base. Stanley Worth, this is the Catholic family again. His mum was a fan of Helen Duncan's. He's the one who went to the seance that he disrupted. He was a War Reserve constable. Rupert Cross was his great mate who lunged at the spirit which appeared and shone his torch into the cabinet and blew his whistle to summon the police that were waiting outside. His father had been a senior police sergeant with the Metropolitan Police and was transferred to Portsmouth. His uncle Percy Worth was chief constable in Scotland Yard, made an MBE in 1942. Stanley had been a special constable before the war. Stayed in the Navy until 1953 when he emigrated, having married in 1949 the sister-in-law of Constable Rupert Cross, his great mate, who also emigrated to New Zealand. So there was a secret meeting of Maud Elam and the Director of Public Prosecutions, and that was the turning point in the history of spiritualism. The DPP and the Chief Inspector West felt that the charge of conspiracy was too shaky because they would have to prove beyond reasonable doubt that money had been paid to see materialised spirits. No event organiser worth their salt would offer that, and as a trained medium myself, I know that you just can't guarantee anything's going to happen at all. You know, you can be all ready to go, and there's just a great silence from beyond, so you cannot guarantee that. Any more than anybody can guarantee that a prayer will be answered, I guess, really. So it took them 1.5 hours to settle a single clause that was really a largely obsolete statute, which was Section 4 of the 1735 Witchcraft Act. And the court was full of it went to the High Court, as I say. The Old Bailey got bombed during it, so they had to meet kind of around the corner. And this was the days when courts still had quill pens, posies of herbs in front of the judge so he didn't have to smell the populace. The place was rammed with law books in case the witchcraft one that they'd chosen fell and they then had to scrabble for something else in turn. Hundreds of people were willing to certify that Helen was marvellous. They heard about 50 of them, which became fairly tedious, and then they said, enough, enough, enough. This all happened before the night in question, so none of it is admissible. So they didn't have much, but, that's Loseby, who was the military man and suffragette supporter and all the rest of it, who was the Defence Counsel. Okay. So one of the telling bits is the Wickham Professor of Logic, Percy Wilson, stated, At the beginning of the trial, I got a message from one of my two sons who were then undergraduates at Oxford and had visited Cowley Spiritualist Church. They met a man called Spencer who was wearing the mayoral chain thing, who asserted that the Cowley works of Morris in the previous year, a young man had made a bet that the next time Mrs. Duncan appeared in Portsmouth, she would be arrested. That bet was taken, the side stakes were given to a third party, Spencer, and when Mrs. Duncan was arrested, the bet was paid. It transpired the principal witness on behalf of the police against Mrs. Duncan was the uncle of the man who'd made the bet. They saw the value of the testimony and didn't call him in Helen's favour at all. She got sentenced to 172 days in prison, I think it was. Churchill kind of intervened and said, don't lock this woman's door, she won't be able to stand it. And she couldn't. She hated being trapped, she hated being in prison. She told fortune, she did bits and pieces for cigarettes and stuff while she was in there. All this happened just before D-Day. The Lord Chief Justice gabbled his summing up. He uttered 4,000 words in 20 minutes, or 3 words a second. Helen came out of prison, tail between her legs again, went north and vowed never to work again. Couldn't help herself, the locals kept coming, and so eventually she built up. Then in later years, in 1956, I think it was, in October, she had a booking in Nottingham. She didn't want to go. She was very ill. She wasn't really up to it. And again, she got raided by the police. And when she had to be taken to hospital because she had electric burns on her breasts and on her belly that was the size of dinner plates. And somebody said, oh, well, she did it to herself. And the doctor there said, don't be so stupid. Nobody could do that to themselves. This time, it was electrocution, basically. And that's what happens when this stuff is pulled out of you. So, that's Maurice Barbadell. Arthur Conan Doyle, Chief Marshal Dowding, great spiritualist, went around the country saying, spiritualism was great, there is no death, believe it, we believe it. They didn't get arrested. There's some of the stuff. That's Helen Duncan again. So, Helen Duncan died in the early hours of the 6th of December 1956, officially of diabetes and heart failure. But that was the end of the greatest medium of the last century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geraldine.